Karen looked directly at Judge Judy and said one sentence that sounded completely harmless. "I was never there." 4 seconds later, Judge Judy had the answer. She did not shout. She did not slam her hand on the bench. She did not even look surprised. She simply lifted one photograph from the folder in front of her, looked at Karen, and asked a question so short that the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Karen's smile disappeared. The plaintiff's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, and the bailiff, who had been standing quietly near the wall, shifted his weight as if he already knew the case had just changed direction. What Karen did not know was that Judge Judy had noticed something during the first few minutes of testimony. It was not the paperwork, it was not the money, it was not even Karen's story. It was the way Karen answered one very simple question, and that tiny reaction was about to expose a lie that had been holding the entire case together. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you are subscribed for more unforgettable courtroom stories, and comment below where you are watching from, because this case was about to turn in a way nobody in that courtroom expected. The case had arrived looking painfully ordinary. A dispute over a missing payment. Karen Whitmore claimed she had never received the money the plaintiff said he had given her. According to Karen, the accusation was nothing more than a desperate attempt by an angry former acquaintance to make her look dishonest. The amount itself was not enormous. But the accusation had damaged something far more valuable than a bank balance. It had damaged trust. The plaintiff was a quiet, 58-year-old handyman named Michael Reynolds. He had spent most of his adult life repairing houses, fixing broken appliances, and doing the kind of work people usually noticed only when something went wrong. He was not a polished courtroom speaker. He carried a thin brown folder that looked as though it had been opened and closed 100 times. Inside were receipts, handwritten notes, and one faded photograph. Michael kept his eyes lowered while Karen spoke. That detail mattered because Karen spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the courtroom belonged to her. She sat upright. Her arms were folded. Her answers came quickly, almost too quickly. She had a response for everything. According to Karen, Michael had never given her the payment. According to Karen, they had never met at the location he described. According to Karen, Michael had misunderstood an old conversation and was now trying to recover money she had never possessed. And according to Karen, there was absolutely nothing Judge Judy could do about it. That last part was not spoken directly, but it was visible in the slight smile, in the relaxed shoulders, in the way Karen glanced toward the courtroom gallery after every answer, almost as though she expected people to admire how easily she was handling the situation. Experienced judges know that confidence is not evidence. Sometimes it is simply performance. Michael, meanwhile, looked nothing like someone performing. He kept one hand resting on the brown folder. Every few seconds, his thumb moved across its worn corner. The motion was small, almost invisible, but it told a story. That folder was not merely a collection of documents. It contained the reason Michael had come to court. Months earlier, Michael had agreed to repair a small rental property owned by Karen's family. The work had taken several weeks. Michael claimed Karen had personally met him at the property, accepted the completed work, and handed him a written acknowledgement after receiving his final invoice. Then the payment disappeared. Karen said the acknowledgement had never existed. Michael said it had. Karen said she had never been at the property on the day he described. Michael said she had stood less than 10 feet away from him. One of them was lying. And Judge Judy had already realized that the truth would not come from listening to either person repeat the same story. It would come from finding the detail neither one could control. That was why she watched Karen so carefully. When Karen mentioned the property, her eyes moved toward the ceiling for half a second. When she mentioned the payment, she looked at Michael. But when Judge Judy mentioned the exact day in question, Karen did something different. She stopped smiling. Only for a moment. Then the smile returned. That moment was easy to miss. Michael missed it. The gallery missed it. Even the people sitting beside Karen missed it. Judge Judy did not. She had seen something that changed the question. Instead of asking Karen to explain the entire story again, she asked something much simpler. "Were you there that afternoon?" Karen answered immediately. No 4 seconds. That was all it took. Judge Judy looked down at the papers, then back at Karen. The room became so quiet that the sound of a chair shifting near the back wall suddenly seemed enormous. Karen leaned forward. "What?" she asked. Judge Judy did not answer immediately. She reached toward the brown folder. Michael's hand moved away from it, and that was when the audience could finally understand why he had protected that folder so carefully. There was something inside it Karen had apparently never expected to see, something that did not need an argument, something that did not need Michael to become emotional, something that could answer the question Karen had just answered for herself. Judge Judy opened the folder. Karen's expression changed again. This time, she could not hide it, because the photograph Judge Judy pulled from the folder was not merely evidence that Karen had been at the property. It showed something else, something that raised a much bigger question. If Karen had truly never been there, why was she holding the one object that only someone inside that house could have possessed? And Judge Judy had not even reached the back of the photograph yet. Michael Reynolds had spent years learning how to repair things other people had already given up on: a broken refrigerator, a leaking sink, a warped door, a damaged floor. He had never considered himself extraordinary. He simply showed up, did the work, and expected people to keep their word. That was why the dispute with Karen Whitmore had affected him so deeply. It was not the amount of money, it was the accusation. Karen had made Michael sound confused, desperate, and dishonest. She had suggested that his memory was unreliable. She had even implied that he had created the entire story because he wanted money from someone who had more of it than he did. Michael never interrupted her. That was one of the first things Judge Judy noticed. People who are desperate to win often interrupt. Michael did not. He waited. His worn brown folder remained on the table in front of him. Inside, it was a small collection of things he had saved because he knew, even before coming to court, that Karen would deny everything. The first document was a simple invoice, nothing dramatic, no secret handwriting, no shocking confession, just a list of repairs, dates, and the amount Michael said remained unpaid. Karen had already dismissed it. She claimed Michael could have created it himself. Judge Judy accepted that possibility without argument. The second piece was a text message. Karen had acknowledged receiving the invoice. Again, Karen had an explanation. She said the message had been taken out of context. The third piece was a photograph of the repaired property. Karen barely looked at it. She called it meaningless, and that was when the case began to change. Because Michael had not brought the photograph to prove that he had done the work. He had brought it because of something visible in the background. Something most people would have ignored. A small blue ceramic planter sat beside the back door. It looked insignificant, but Michael remembered it. He remembered where it had been. And more importantly, he remembered who had been holding it when the photograph was taken. Karen. That was the detail Judge Judy had been waiting to examine. The photograph had been taken after the repairs were completed. Karen insisted she had never been at the property that afternoon, yet there she was, not standing in the center of the frame, not posing for the camera, just partially visible near the doorway. Her hand rested on the blue planter. It was a tiny detail, but tiny details are dangerous when someone has built an entire story around denying that they were ever there. Judge Judy turned the photograph toward Karen. Karen leaned forward. Her face tightened. Then she laughed. It was a short laugh, almost dismissive. She claimed the image had been manipulated. Michael finally looked up. Judge Judy did not react emotionally. She simply studied Karen. The narrator could see what Karen apparently could not. Her confidence was beginning to change. It was no longer relaxed. It was defensive. There is a difference. A confident person answers a question. A defensive person begins searching for a way around it. Karen started doing exactly that. She claimed the photograph could have been taken on another day. Judge Judy asked whether Karen recognized the property. Karen said yes. Judge Judy asked whether she recognized the doorway. Karen said yes. Judge Judy asked whether she recognized the blue planter. Karen hesitated. Then she said she did not. That hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough because Karen had just identified the location while denying the one object that could place her inside it. Judge Judy looked back at Michael. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. His hand simply returned to the edge of the brown folder. The deeper meaning of the case was becoming clearer. Michael was not fighting to prove that he was smarter than Karen. He was fighting against being rewritten. Someone had taken his work, challenged his memory, and then tried to convince him that what he knew had happened never happened at all. That is why some courtroom disputes become emotional long before anyone raises their voice. The real battle is not always over money. Sometimes it is over whether another person gets to rewrite your memory of what happened. Judge Judy seemed to understand that. But she also understood something else. The photograph was only the beginning. Karen had managed to explain away the invoice. She had explained away the message. She had tried to explain away the photograph. But every explanation created another question. And every question brought the court closer to the one thing Karen had not prepared for. The final proof, Judge Judy looked down at the photograph again. Then she noticed the date printed beneath it. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes changed, because the date did not simply prove Karen had been at the property. It connected the photograph to a document Karen had already introduced herself. And suddenly, the courtroom had a contradiction that could not be explained away as memory. Karen had spent the entire hearing saying she was never there, but the date on the photograph suggested she had been there on the exact afternoon she had just denied. Judge Judy placed the photograph back on the table. Then she asked Karen one final question before moving on. "Who took this picture?" Karen answered quickly. "I don't know." Judge Judy nodded. She did not challenge her. Not yet, because there was something Karen did not know. The photographer's name was already written on the back, and that name was about to connect Karen to a second location, a second conversation, and a piece of evidence Michael had never mentioned in his opening statement. The courtroom was still unaware of how deep the story went, but Judge Judy was no longer trying to determine whether Karen had been there. She was beginning to determine why Karen was so desperate to pretend she had not. Karen Whitmore had not walked into Judge Judy's courtroom expecting a fight. She had walked in expecting control. There was a difference. Karen was the owner of a small property management company that handled several rental homes in the area. She was polished, organized, and accustomed to speaking with people who needed something from her. Her clothes were understated but expensive. Her paperwork was neatly arranged. Her answers were practiced. And most importantly, Karen was used to being believed. That confidence had protected her for years. When tenants complained, she called them confused. When contractors challenged a payment, she called them mistaken. When someone questioned one of her decisions, she described them as emotional. Judge Judy noticed the pattern before Karen finished her first explanation. Karen did not simply defend herself. She tried to define Michael. That was more revealing. Michael was not merely wrong, according to Karen. He was confused. He was exaggerating. He was remembering events incorrectly. And eventually, Karen suggested that he had probably misunderstood their entire business arrangement. That was not a defense. It was an attempt to erase the witness instead of answering the evidence. Judge Judy watched without interruption. Karen seemed to mistake silence for agreement. That was her first serious mistake. The courtroom had begun to understand the contrast between the two people. Michael sat quietly with his worn folder. Karen sat comfortably behind her polished stack of documents. One looked like a man trying to prove what had happened. The other looked like a woman trying to prove that the man himself could not be trusted. And then Karen made the mistake that changed the atmosphere. She turned slightly toward Michael and smiled, not a friendly smile, a dismissive one. "You know," she said, "some people remember what they wish had happened." Michael's jaw tightened. He looked down. Judge Judy's eyes moved toward him for just a moment. Then back to Karen. Karen seemed pleased with herself. She had found what she thought was the weakness in the case, Michael's memory. If she could make the courtroom believe that Michael was simply confused, then every document could become questionable. Every date could become uncertain. Every conversation could become his word against hers. That strategy works surprisingly often outside a courtroom. People do not always attack the evidence first. Sometimes they attack the person carrying it. Judge Judy knew exactly what Karen was doing. But she did not stop her. She let Karen continue. Karen explained that Michael had performed some work at the property, but insisted she had not personally supervised it. She said other people had access. She said Michael might have confused her with someone else. She said the photograph could have been taken at another time. And when Judge Judy asked who had taken the photograph, Karen gave the same answer. "I don't know." The answer sounded confident, but Judge Judy did not look convinced. She reached toward the photograph again. The back was facing upward. Karen could not see what was written there from where she sat. Judge Judy turned it over. A name was written in black ink. Daniel Carter Michael had never mentioned him. Karen had earlier in the hearing. Karen had casually referred to Daniel as a maintenance supervisor who sometimes visited the property. That small statement suddenly mattered, because if Daniel had taken the photograph, then Karen's claim that she had never been at the property on that date had a serious problem. Daniel was not just a random worker. He had been hired by Karen. And, according to the documents already submitted, he had been scheduled at the property that same afternoon. Judge Judy looked at Karen. "Do you know Daniel Carter?" Karen answered immediately. "Yes." "Was he working at the property that day?" Karen hesitated. Then she nodded. "Yes." The courtroom became quieter. Judge Judy asked another question. "Did you speak with him that day?" Karen's eyes moved toward her attorney. Only for a moment, but the movement was obvious. She looked back at Judge Judy. "I don't remember." That was the second crack. Not because forgetting a conversation automatically proves dishonesty. It doesn't. But Karen had just given two different kinds of answers. When the answer protected her, she was certain. When the answer could place her inside the property, suddenly her memory became uncertain. Judge Judy noticed. So did Michael. Karen leaned back, her arms folded tighter. The narrator could almost see the calculation happening. She had entered the courtroom, believing the case would be about whether Michael could prove a payment. Now it was becoming a question of why Karen had denied being somewhere she appeared to have been, and that was a much more dangerous question. Judge Judy looked at Michael. "Mr. Reynolds, did you speak with Daniel Carter?" Michael nodded. "Yes. About what?" Michael glanced at Karen. Then he opened the brown folder. "About the payment." Karen's posture changed. Judge Judy noticed Michael pulled out another sheet. It was not a receipt. It was not an invoice. It was a handwritten note. Daniel had written it after the repair work was completed. The note contained a simple statement confirming that Karen had arrived at the property that afternoon. Karen immediately objected. She claimed the note was unreliable. Judge Judy did not appear impressed, but she also did not reveal what she was thinking. Instead, she asked Karen one question. "Why would your own employee write that you were there?" Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time that morning, she had no prepared answer. Then she recovered. She said Daniel must have been mistaken. Judge Judy nodded slowly. The courtroom seemed to relax for half a second. Then Judge Judy looked back at the photograph, and that was when Karen made her biggest mistake yet. She said, almost casually, "Even if I was there, that doesn't mean I accepted anything from him." The words landed harder than a shout. Michael looked up. Judge Judy became completely still because Karen had just changed her story. Only minutes earlier, she had said she was never there. Now she was saying that even if she had been there, she had not accepted the payment. The first statement denied the location. The second statement accepted the possibility of the location. That was not a small difference. That was a contradiction. Judge Judy leaned forward. The courtroom waited. Karen seemed to realize what she had done. Her confidence flickered, and Judge Judy finally reached for the evidence Karen had not yet seen. The photograph was only one piece. Daniel's note was another. But the final piece had something Karen had never expected to hear in court, a timestamp. And when Judge Judy asked for the courtroom monitor to be turned on, Karen's face went completely still because the evidence she was about to see did not merely show where she had been. It showed what she had done there. The courtroom monitor flickered to life. Karen did not move. Judge Judy looked toward the screen, then back at Karen. The photograph had already established that Karen had been at the property. Daniel's handwritten note had established that she had spoken with him. But the video was different. A photograph could be questioned. A handwritten note could be challenged. A video had a way of taking the argument out of someone's hands. Michael sat perfectly still. He had never mentioned the recording during his opening statement. That was deliberate. He had not wanted to overwhelm the case with evidence. He had wanted Karen to tell her own story first. And now she had. Judge Judy asked the clerk to play the footage. The screen showed the back entrance of the rental property. The timestamp appeared in the lower corner. The date matched the afternoon Karen had just denied being there. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a car entered the frame. Karen recognized it immediately. Her shoulders dropped. The car stopped beside the house. A woman stepped out. It was Karen. There was no dramatic entrance, no argument, no shouting. She simply walked toward the back door carrying a small envelope. The courtroom remained silent. Karen stared at the screen. The narrator could see the psychological reversal happening in real time. Only minutes earlier, Karen had been controlling the room through confidence. Now the room was controlling her through evidence. The video continued. Michael appeared at the door. Karen handed him the envelope. Michael opened it. Then he looked down at a document. Karen pointed toward it. The audio was faint, but clear enough. She was discussing the final payment. Then she said something that changed the entire case. She told Michael the remaining amount would be handled after the repair records were updated. Michael nodded. Karen walked away. The video ended. Nobody spoke. Judge Judy did not immediately look at Karen. She looked at the screen, then she looked down at the photograph, then at Daniel's note. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 different sources. One story, Karen had been there. She had spoke with Michael. She had discussed the payment, and she had lied about all 3. This was no longer a simple disagreement over whether money had changed hands. The case had become something deeper. Karen had not merely forgotten an afternoon. She had constructed an alternate version of it. Judge Judy finally turned toward her. Karen tried to speak. Judge Judy raised one hand. Karen stopped. The judge's calmness was more powerful than anger would have been. She asked Karen to explain the video. Karen stared at the screen. Then she said the words people often reach for when their version of events begins collapsing. "That doesn't prove what you think it proves." Judge Judy looked at her. Karen continued. "The envelope could have contained anything." Judge Judy nodded. That argument might have worked if the video were the only evidence. It wasn't. Judge Judy reached for the photograph. She placed it beside Daniel's note. Then she placed the invoice next to both. The dates aligned, the timeline aligned, the people aligned. And the payment Karen had denied discussing was now connected to a physical document Michael had been carrying from the beginning. The narrator could see why Judge Judy had waited. She had not wanted to accuse Karen of lying too early. She had wanted Karen to create the contradiction herself. That is the difference between confrontation and exposure. Confrontation gives someone an opportunity to change the story. Exposure leaves the story nowhere to go. Karen's attorney attempted to interrupt. Judge Judy stopped him with a brief glance. The courtroom went quiet again. Then Judge Judy asked Karen a question. "Were you there?" Karen swallowed. "Yes." It was the first direct answer she had given that matched the evidence. Judge Judy followed immediately. "Did you speak with Mr. Reynolds?" Karen hesitated. "Yes." "Did you discuss the payment?" Karen looked down. "Yes." The room seemed to release one long breath. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. He did not celebrate. He simply sat there because this was the moment he had been waiting for, not revenge. Recognition for months. He had been told that his memory was wrong. Now the evidence had spoken for him. But Judge Judy was not finished. She looked back at the video. "Why did you say you were never there?" Karen had no answer. She tried to explain that she had been under stress. She said she had misunderstood the question. She said she had not considered the property visit important. But none of those explanations addressed the contradiction. The narrator could almost hear the courtroom thinking the same thing. If the visit was so unimportant, why deny it? That question mattered because the lie had never been about the location. It had been about what happened there. Karen had not wanted the court to examine the envelope. She had not wanted the court to connect her to the payment discussion. And she certainly had not wanted anyone asking what happened after she handed Michael that envelope. Judge Judy opened the final page of the folder. Karen saw it. Her face changed. The page contained a bank transaction. Not Michael's, Karen's. The transaction showed a withdrawal made shortly before the meeting. Then, beside it, was a copy of the written acknowledgement Michael had kept. The amount matched. The date matched. And there was one handwritten phrase on the document. Final payment received. Karen stared at it. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Judy placed the document on the bench. Then she looked at Karen. The lie had lasted less than an hour. The evidence had taken seconds. But the deeper truth was finally visible. Karen had not simply denied being at the property. She had denied the conversation because admitting the conversation would force her to admit she had received the payment. And now the final question was no longer whether Karen had lied. It was why she had lied. Because the bank record suggested something Michael himself did not yet know. The payment had been withdrawn. The envelope had been handed over. The acknowledgement had been signed. Yet Michael had never received the money he was owed. Judge Judy slowly looked back at the screen, then at Karen. And for the first time that morning, Karen stopped trying to defend herself. She started looking frightened because the next piece of evidence was not about one missing payment. It was about whether this had happened before. Karen Whitmore had entered the courtroom, believing one lie could protect everything else. It could not. Judge Judy looked down at the stack of documents one final time, the photograph. Daniel Carter's handwritten note, the security footage, the bank records, the payment acknowledgement. And finally, the complaint from another contractor whose story followed the same pattern, different person. Different repair, same explanation, same signature, same missing payment. The courtroom had stopped feeling like a dispute between two people. It felt like a pattern finally being brought into the light. Karen's attorney tried to argue that the documents did not establish intent. Judge Judy listened. She did not interrupt. Then she turned toward Karen. "Did you tell this court you were never there?" Karen nodded slowly. "Yes." "Was that true?" Karen looked down. "No." The answer was barely audible, but everyone heard it. Michael closed his eyes. For months, he had carried the weight of being called confused. Now, the person who had questioned his memory had finally admitted that hers had not been the problem. The lie had been. Judge Judy looked at the other documents. She explained that the court was not going to treat the case as a simple misunderstanding. The evidence showed that Karen had knowingly denied being present, contradicted herself about the payment, and attempted to shift responsibility onto the person demanding what he was owed. The financial records made the situation even more serious. The court awarded Michael the full amount he was seeking, along with allowable damages connected to the dispute. But the money was not the moment Michael remembered. The moment he remembered came when Judge Judy looked directly at him and acknowledged that he had brought the evidence instead of relying on anger. Michael's shoulders finally relaxed. He did not smile immediately. He simply looked down at the old brown folder. That folder had started the morning looking like the possession of a man nobody believed. Now it looked like something else. Proof. Judge Judy then turned back toward Karen. Her voice remained controlled. There was no need for humiliation. The evidence had already done the work. Then came the line that stayed with everyone in the courtroom. Your lie was small, but it was carrying the weight of every truth you hoped nobody would examine. Karen lowered her eyes. The confidence that had filled her posture earlier was gone. She had entered the courtroom believing Michael was the vulnerable one. Instead, she had discovered that vulnerability and weakness were not the same thing. Michael had been vulnerable because he had trusted someone. Karen had mistaken that trust for weakness. That mistake had cost her. The court also directed that the additional evidence concerning the other contractors be preserved for appropriate review outside the narrow payment dispute. It was not a dramatic courtroom spectacle. There were no cameras flashing outside, no crowd gathered around the courthouse, no overnight transformation into a national scandal, and that made the ending more powerful. Because sometimes justice does not need to become famous to matter. Within 24 hours, Michael returned to work. He repaired a damaged kitchen cabinet for a customer who had no idea what had happened in court. 48 hours later, he received a call confirming that the judgment paperwork had been processed. And 72 hours later, he opened the brown folder one last time. He looked at the photograph. The blue planter was still visible near the doorway. For months, that photograph had represented uncertainty. Now it represented something completely different. The smallest detail had become the strongest witness. Michael put the photograph back inside the folder. Then he closed it. He did not need to carry it everywhere anymore. That was the quiet justice of the case. He had not walked into court looking for revenge. He had walked in wanting someone to believe what had happened, and eventually the evidence made that impossible to deny. Karen, meanwhile, faced questions about the other contractor complaints and the records connected to them. The courtroom had resolved Michael's dispute, but the documents had opened another door. A door Karen herself had accidentally unlocked when she decided one lie was safer than one uncomfortable truth. And that was the lesson Judge Judy's courtroom left behind. A lie rarely travels alone. It needs explanations. Then more explanations, then new versions of old explanations. Eventually, the story becomes so complicated that the truth only needs one thing to defeat it. Proof, Karen's first answer had taken less than 4 seconds. Her explanation lasted much longer, but those 4 seconds had been enough to reveal the first crack, because the moment she said, "I was never there," the photograph was already waiting. The video was already waiting. The bank record was already waiting. And the truth had already been sitting inside Michael's worn brown folder. The courtroom did not need to shout to expose her. It simply needed to look closely. That is why this case was never really about a missing payment. It was about dignity. It was about what happens when someone tries to make another person doubt their own memory. And it was about the quiet strength of bringing the truth into a room where someone else has already decided you will not be believed. Michael left with his judgment. But more importantly, He left knowing that his memory had not failed him. The blue planter remained in the photograph, a tiny object most people would have ignored. Yet it became the detail that helped unravel an entire story. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive with a confession. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner of a photograph, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. If this story reminded you that truth still matters, subscribe for more courtroom stories where arrogance finally meets accountability. And comment below, if you had been sitting in that courtroom, would you have believed Karen before the evidence appeared? Your script successfully completed .nt the entire morning trying to make the case look like a misunderstanding. Now Judge Judy had uncovered something much more serious. The bank record showed that Karen had withdrawn the exact amount Michael was owed. The video showed her arriving at the property. The photograph placed her inside. Daniel's note confirmed the meeting. And Michael's acknowledgement connected all of it to the payment. But there was still one question hanging over the courtroom. Where had the money gone? Karen stared at the document. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered something. She shook her head. For the first time, the polished confidence was gone. Judge Judy did not rush. She allowed the evidence to sit in the silence. That silence mattered because when someone has spent an entire hearing controlling the conversation, silence becomes the one thing they cannot control. Judge Judy turned to Michael. Did you receive this money? Michael shook his head. No. Did you sign this acknowledgement? Michael looked at the document. Yes, his voice became quieter. I thought it meant she had agreed to pay the balance. Judge Judy looked at the page again. The wording was simple. The final payment had been acknowledged, but the money itself had never reached Michael. That distinction changed everything. Karen immediately tried to speak. She signed that because I told her the payment was being processed. Michael looked confused. Judge Judy turned toward Karen. You just said you gave him the payment. Karen froze. Only a few minutes earlier, she had said the envelope could have contained anything. Now she was claiming the payment had been processed. The story was collapsing faster than she could rebuild it. Judge Judy asked for the bank statement again. The withdrawal was clear. The money had been taken out in cash. There was no electronic transfer, no check, no deposit, no record showing Michael ever received it. Then Judge Judy noticed the date on another document. 2 weeks later, Karen had withdrawn the same amount again. This time, the withdrawal was made from a different account connected to one of her rental properties. Michael stared at the page. He had not known about the second withdrawal. Neither had the courtroom. Karen's attorney reached for the document. Judge Judy stopped him. The second transaction raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Michael was not the only person Karen had told that she had already paid. Judge Judy asked the clerk to bring forward the property ledger. A few pages later, the pattern began to emerge. One unpaid contractor. Then another, different names, different repair jobs, different dates. But the same strange structure. A payment would supposedly be made. A contractor would sign an acknowledgement. The money would appear in Karen's records as an expense, but the contractors claimed they had never received it. Karen had not simply created one explanation for Michael. She appeared to have created a system. The courtroom changed instantly. What had looked like one private dispute now looked like a repeated pattern. The narrator could see the power reversal clearly. Karen had entered the courtroom believing Michael was one person she could dismiss. But the documents suggested there were others, people who had trusted her, people who had accepted her explanations. People who may have walked away believing they were the ones who had misunderstood. Judge Judy looked at Karen. Is this your handwriting? Karen stared at the page. Yes. Did you record these payments? Yes. Did these people receive the money? Karen hesitated. I don't know. Judge Judy's expression did not change. That answer was different from her earlier answers. Earlier, Karen had been certain. Now she was uncertain about everything. That was the psychological collapse. Not panic, not screaming. The disappearance of certainty. Judge Judy returned to Michael's brown folder. The old photograph was still lying on the bench. The blue planter was visible near the doorway. It had seemed meaningless at the beginning. Now it had become the symbol of the entire case. Karen had denied being there. The photograph proved she was. Karen had denied speaking with Michael. The video proved she did. Karen had denied discussing payment. The recording proved she did. Karen had implied Michael was confused. The documents proved his timeline was accurate, and now the financial records suggested the missing payment was part of something much larger. Judge Judy looked at Michael. His eyes were wet, but he remained composed. He had spent months wondering whether anyone would believe him. Now he no longer needed to convince anyone. The evidence had done it. Karen tried one final defense. She said the other contractors were unrelated. She said Michael's case was still only a disagreement, but Judge Judy had already reached the point where the disagreement was no longer the issue was credibility. One person had told the truth about where she was. The other had changed her story every time the evidence closed another escape route. Judge Judy gathered the documents into a single stack. Then she looked at Karen. "You told this court you were never there." Karen said nothing. "You later admitted you were there." Still nothing. "You denied discussing payment." Karen looked down, and now we have a recording of that discussion. Karen's face had gone pale. Judge Judy paused. Then she lifted the bank statement. "And this tells the court the money was withdrawn." The courtroom became completely silent. Karen finally whispered that she could explain. Judge Judy looked at her. "Then explain it." Karen opened her mouth. No words came. That was the moment Michael finally understood. The case was no longer about whether Judge Judy believed him. She did. It was about what consequence would follow from Karen's deception. But before Judge Judy could deliver the final decision, another document was brought into the courtroom. It was a complaint filed by a different contractor, same property company, same kind of payment, same handwritten acknowledgement. And the signature at the bottom belonged to Karen. Judge Judy looked at the document. Then she looked at Karen. Karen's eyes closed. The courtroom had reached the point where one lie was no longer standing alone. It was connected to a pattern. And now Judge Judy had to decide what to do with everything that had just been uncovered.